Hello, welcome to Tech Bugs and Rock and Roll. Now, this is it's a deviation from our usual format, isn't it,
It's
Mark?
it's it's weird. Yeah, nobody's here. It's just nobody here but us chickens. And
Because by the time you all watch this at 4 o'clock UK time on Thursday, I'm going to be in an aeroplane somewhere over Norway on my way from Trondheim to Oslo, and
and I think I will actually be on stage speaking about how JavaScript happened at Devox in France.
we had a little chat and realized that doing the show live while one of us is on an aeroplane and the other one is doing a different talk might be tricky.
Yeah.
So and when we put this thing together back in January, we're like, there are going to be weeks we can't do it. So we've got a bunch of different ideas. And one of the things we said is, look, if one of us can't do it, we'll get a guest on and we'll do it live and it'll be fun. And we
Yeah.
didn't expect that the first week that one of us was genuinely unavailable, the other one would be genuinely unavailable as well. So instead, we're pre-recording this. So this is it's like actual television, isn't it?
Yes, it's currently
like
in the morning on a Saturday, which is unusual
yeah.
for me. I don't normally see those.
So caveat, if anything happens between Saturday lunchtime and Thursday afternoon, which renders any of the content of this staggeringly insensitive or ill, like if all the musicians we talk about in this podcast all die on Monday, we didn't know and it wasn't our fault.
Or if the new Apple spaceship campus has burned down and you've tuned in thinking, well, they'll definitely be talking about that. Then
we'll pick that up next week.
We don't know, but we'll talk about it next week. Yes.
So yes, what we're going to do this week is we're going to do a bit of a geek out. So once in a while we'll do one of these shows where we pick a topic that both of us love, but I think it's fair to say kind of the role that it's played in our lives has been very, very different in terms of how we were exposed to it and what happened and when. Yeah. And this week we're geeking out about music because we love music, and we love the same kind of music because we're English middle-aged white men who like music that gets provided free when you buy a Ford Mondeo.
Yes,
that kind of thing.
I'm interested because I think that there's obviously a very large overlap in the sets of music that we like, but I do think there's probably a bunch of music that I kind of still like from my childhood that you're probably not so big into, and vice versa. And so I think it'd be interesting.
So let's kick it off. Now we're going to do this sort of chronologically because I thought a really interesting place to start. What is the first song you ever remember hearing that someone could go out now and listen to on Spotify? What's like the earliest memory you have, which is real music as opposed to nursery rhymes in kindergarten or something?
Yes. So for me, and it's early enough that I can't remember how old I was, but it sticks out, and there was other music being played because my father listened to a lot of classical music.
Yeah.
But I remember the Wimoway song before Tight Fit covered it. So in the jungle, the lion sleeps tonight. That's what it's called, isn't it?
I didn't know that was a cover. I thought it was a Tight Fit original.
So it existed. I think it was like a traditional African song or something.
Yeah.
But I remember that, and I remember loving that, and just going ooh away.
The beautiful irony being, of course, that would be your earliest childhood song from not very close to Africa at all.
Absolutely.
Whereas, I remember
from Hastings,
that hotbed of traditional tribal music.
Yes.
Whereas, I spent my childhood in Africa, and I remember hearing, the sort of work crews working on the streets and digging plantations and stuff, singing. And I don't know why I used the word plantations there. They were fields. No one called them plantations. Zimbabwe had big, tobacco farming and fruit farming and all this kind of stuff. And when there was a bunch of guys out building walls and stuff, you'd sometimes hear them singing and, don't recognize the words, but the tunes were nice. But my earliest musical memory has nothing to do with the environment I grew up in, because it's lying in bed at night and my parents were listening to music and trying to work out what the words were to Chariots of Fire. Because through the wall, I couldn't hear it well enough. I assumed that it must be some melody that I just couldn't make out the words because I sort of didn't know about instrumentals at that point.
Yeah.
You know, when you're that young, all the songs you know are songs you're taught to help you remember words like A, B, C, D, and the wheels on the bus. And so the idea of just a tune which didn't have any words kind of didn't compute yet. And so yeah, the main theme from Chariots of Fire is probably the earliest thing I remember listening to that you can still go on Spotify and be like, oh yeah, let's listen to that.
Yes, and that's kind of also showing up the 5-year age gap here, isn't it? Or what, is it 5 years? I'm 50.
So I was born in 78, so
I'm 51. So yeah, 5 years.
The hit single, someone got me a CD of the top 10 songs in the month I was born, and one of them was Forever Autumn from Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds, which I thought was quite cool because we're going to talk about that later as well.
Yes. So but no, it's so if my parents had had better musical taste, my father in particular, I was born a month before Dark Side of the Moon.
Yeah.
So I am basically the same age so I had my 50th birthday last year.
Yeah.
And Roger Waters did weird things to Dark Side of the Moon to celebrate the 50th anniversary of that.
That was I listened to the whole thing, and I still haven't decided whether I like it or not.
I don't think I will ever listen to it again.
Yeah.
I don't think I hated it.
Yes.
I know why he did it.
Yeah.
And good luck to him and everything. And also, I know Roger Waters has been in a spot of bother lately with his political views.
Spots of bother for a long while.
That's fairly standard for Roger Waters. But I will always be grateful to him for the music.
No, I'm the same. I listened to his 50th anniversary re-recording of Dark Side of the Moon all the way through once and went, that's kind of interesting. And yeah, I don't think I'll ever listen to it again. It's just not the kind of thing that makes you go, oh, that was a good bit. And
so I went and checked. The Lion Sleeps Tonight was originally written and recorded by Solomon Linda under the title Mboobi for the South African Gallo Record Company in 1939. And was originally written in Zulu.
Wow. So, actually, the wow there is the South African Gallo Record Company, because so many of my parents had loads of vinyl records, which eventually I inherited and went through religiously and listened to all of them. And then when I went to university, they went in a cardboard box in the attic, and then they went to a charity shop and were never seen again.
Yes. Sorry, I feel I should point out, with you saying you've inherited their albums, Dylan's parents are fine.
Oh, they are fine. They stopped owning a record player.
Yes, yeah.
And also that would have been them taking them to a charity shop from beyond the grave while I was at university. Yeah. Which no, they got handed down. Like it started off with they bought a CD player and started buying stuff on CD, and then eventually I got the hi-fi with the turntable and got all the records with it. And then when I started listening to CDs as well, I think they just assumed no one was listening to records anymore, and so it all went.
Was much of that vinyl published by the Gallo Record Company?
Quite a lot of it was, because quite a lot of it was bought in Zimbabwe, and Gallo was like the African sort of licensee distributor for bands like, I remember Air Supply. We had Air Supply's greatest hits was on Gallo. And then, and it's one thing, like I don't think until a moment ago I'd ever been conscious of the fact that I just stopped seeing the Gallo record label at some point in my life. But obviously I did, because it's an African distributor. So there was actually this weird quirk. There's so you know how a lot of countries, they have these rules about what proportion of the music on the radio must be domestic.
I'm aware that France certainly has that as a law. And
they had so Canada, this was a big thing, and a lot of internationally successful Canadian acts, Rush, Bryan Adams, Celine Dion, they kind of, I'm not going to say they got their break because of national favoritism or anything, but they found it easy to get a degree of exposure that they might have struggled to get outside Canada, because as Canadian artists, the radio was like, it's Canadian and it's quite good. Like, we can
Yes.
fill our quota this week with music we actually like. And certainly, a band like Rush, their debut album would have benefited from the sort of exposure that prog rock trio, power trios didn't really get on the radio.
Yes.
But Zambia, where my mum grew up, they had the same thing in the 70s. Zamrock is an entire genre of kind of slightly psychedelic tinge rock music by Zambian musicians made for the Zambian market and Zambian radio. And it's one of those things that, it happened and then it sort of vanished into obscurity, but now you can find it online. And there are like Zamrock compilations on Spotify and stuff. And
go looking for that.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff to check out. I don't think they ever had like a big international breakthrough artist. But I went down a little Zamrock rabbit hole last year and discovered that one of the most successful Zamrock artists is actually still going, and they were playing in London the week previously, and I missed it. And it's like, oh,
that's a shame.
So close, like 30 years, and then suddenly, I missed it by a week. So,
but no, I think your experience with music that you encountered because your parents were listening to it, I'm pretty sure it's very different from mine, because I know your dad taught you to play guitar.
He did. He showed me the first couple of things. So my father has always been an enthusiastic guitar player, who kind of, once in a while he'll put the hours in and he'll decide he wants to learn a bunch of songs. And when we've done occasional shows together, we have a rehearsal program. But it's not, I don't think, the thing that he picks up when he has a couple of spare hours. Right. And so when I was 9 years old, he had this acoustic guitar, and he showed me how to play House of the Rising Sun by the Animals, and a couple of 3-chord songs and things. And then I started having guitar lessons, which of course was trying to teach classical fingering and sheet music to a 10-year-old kid who just discovered Living on a Prayer by Bon Jovi and did not deliver the results that the teacher was hoping for. But I mean, I can still remember the first song I ever learned to play properly on the guitar was Sakura, which is a Japanese folk song about cherry blossom, which shows up as, if you know the Bon Jovi album that Time Forgot, 7,800 Degrees Fahrenheit, which was the one. It came out, so there was Bon Jovi was their debut album, and that kind of had Runaway on it, which was a big hit. And then there was Fahrenheit, which even the band are like, it wasn't very good. I'm like, it was very good. I love that record. And side 2, the opening track, is a song called Tokyo Road, which opens with Sakura, a little keyboard arrangement of it. Right. And so I was like, I know how to play that one. I learned that in guitar lessons.
But no, I am not aware of my father ever listening to pop music on his own account. If you like. So he listened to a lot of classical, and he had a very, very fancy kind of expensive turntable it had a solid glass platter. And so it took a long time to get up to speed, but then it was incredibly stable once it had. And his armchair was by the stereo, and it was like separate amp and tape deck and all those sorts of things. And if you sat in his chair, that was trouble. But he listened to classical, including Hooked on Classics. I remember those. But the main thing,
Hooked on Classics, I don't recognize.
Hooked on Classics was kind of, the Classic FM do compilation albums of the 100 best tunes as voted for by listeners. So Hooked on Classics was sort of that kind of thing. It was very accessible, trying to get like the working classes to listen to classical music and doing slightly kind of funkier versions of things and all that sort of stuff. And so I remember those. But where your dad taught you or got you on the path to playing the guitar, my dad inadvertently, just by playing them over and over and over again, taught me the words to almost every single Flanders and Swan song. So, and I still,
you had to obey it to buy a French horn in a second-hand shop, kind of thing.
I was actually saying to Eli We should do a parody version of that.
I once had a whim and I had to obey it to cover a whimsical music hall song.
There you go, you see. But no, so I still remember all the words to both sections of the hippopotamus song. Bold hippopotamus was standing one day. And A Transport of Delight, which is about a London bus.
Yeah.
And all that stuff. And it was only when I grew up and sort of investigated that kind of music, I was kind of like, I want to play this for my kids. The thing that really throws me is he never put anything by Tom Lehrer on. And it's sort of people who like Flanders and Swan. And so for any people who were listening at home and don't know who the hell Flanders and Swan are, fair play. They were a thing in the 50s. They were a double act. Michael Flanders was the singer and raconteur, and he was in a wheelchair. And Donald Swan was the pianist, very, very accomplished pianist. And they were basically a music hall act. And Michael Flanders would just go off on these long, rambling stories and then bring it round to a song that they would sing together. And yeah, but I still remember singing Mud, Mud, Glorious Mud in the bath, at bath time. Like when there was a mum in the room and a brother at the other end of the bathtub, and we would sing that song. So yeah, and very, very few of my school chums were listening to Flanders and Swan. But I don't remember the Beatles. I don't remember Bowie. I don't remember, or Bowie, however. I don't even know how to pronounce David's surname. Yeah. So there was none of that. Whereas you were listening to Vangelis Through the Wall, and
so there was the album that apparently the sort of tipping point in all of this was the soundtrack to An Officer and a Gentleman. And this was my folks would go to the movies. They saw this when it came out in 1980 something, and my dad loved the soundtrack and went and bought the album, and that was he says, it's the first time so Joe Cocker and Jennifer Warnes won the Oscar for Up Where We Belong. ZZ Top is on that soundtrack. Tunnel of Love by Dire Straits is on there. He said it's the first Dire Straits song he ever heard. And Lee Ritenour has a bunch of instrumental guitar stuff. He's the session player who did the sort of the instrumental interludes on that record. Pat Benatar. So it was this real, like, if you want a sort of crash course introduction to a whole bunch of different musical styles that were going to go on to become influential on the way my father's influence kind of carried down to me. The soundtrack to An Officer and a Gentleman is probably the turning point. And it's the one that got him into Dire Straits. And then the first album I ever bought with my own money was Money for Nothing, the Dire Straits kind of late 80s greatest hits compilation that they did.
That's quite classy.
Yeah. And that was, I remember that opening break on Money for Nothing was probably the thing that made me go, I need to learn how to do that. Yes. Because that sounds like it might be important. And And I was actually, I saw a lovely interview. Mark Knopfler has recently auctioned off a lot of his guitars to raise money for charity and done a new version of Going Home, the local hero theme, with about 100, just this astonishing roster of guest musicians. Jeff Beck, Steve Vai, Joe Satriani, I think Carlos Santana. I don't know. It's on YouTube and literally all the names just come up and they all get like one bar. Like all these guitarists, they just get to play one lick and then that's it, and they're done. And apparently his producer and the keyboard player, Guy Fletcher, assembled the whole thing off files that got sent in by email, which must have been a hell of a job.
That does not sound like fun.
But no, there was I saw on TV, I saw a televised interview with Mark Knopfler. He's talking about all these guitars and saying, they're all guitars that were kind of instrumental in writing a certain song, and some of those songs then he'd play them on something else when he was playing them live, and he saying one of the big challenges is when he's doing it in the studio, he doesn't write the guitar parts. He just improvises them. He kind of,
Yes.
maybe works out one or two riffs, but most of the solos are just things he did.
Yeah.
And it sounded good on the day. And then it's like, oh, well, now
I have to remember what I did.
The realization that the crowd are expecting, like the little flourish at the end of Sultans of Swing.
Oh, yeah.
He said it took him a long while to realize that if he doesn't do that, the audience gets upset because they've developed their own relationship with this piece of music.
Yes.
Which to him was just, like he said, kind of like a little throwaway thing that sounded fun on the day. And his wife calls it the fiddly bits. And he says, I came off stage one night and I didn't think the show had gone very well. And she said to me, well, did you play the fiddly bits? And he went, I didn't play them tonight. I was like, well, that's why the show didn't work.
People only come for the fiddly bits. I don't care about the main chorus.
What was the first record you ever bought? The first recording you ever went out and bought with your pocket money?
So I remember the first thing I got that I asked for, it was a Christmas present. And I got a Sinclair ZX81 for my 9th birthday. Sheltered life I had. And to save programs or to load things that you bought in WH Smith's, you had to have a tape recorder, and this was the first time I had ever owned my own thing that could play music as well. And so I said I wanted my own tape for Christmas, and it was Adam and the Ants, and it was whichever album had ant music and the sort of main Adam and the Ants album.
Stand and Deliver. That was
Stand and Deliver.
I don't know them at all.
I think that was the album
on the album cover, but I couldn't tell you what songs were on it.
So yes, that was the first album that I chose. I also remember being at the fun fair in Hastings, the sort of travelling fun fair that turned up and pitched up on the Oval for a week every summer, and I won one of those things, Hoopla or whatever, and you could choose a prize, and there was the Star Wars soundtrack on vinyl, and so I got that. Mainly for the Cantina music, obviously. But the first one I bought with my own money, I was actually probably 14 or something, because having been brought up on Flanders and Swan and everything, I don't think I'd really learned to like music. And so the first album I bought with my own money was the first Beastie Boys album. And again, I still remember quite a lot of the words from that, and that would also have been on cassette.
Beastie Boys are one of those bands that when I see someone put them down at a karaoke night, I sort of look around the room, I'm like, who's that? And do they know what they're doing?
I mean, it's usually Benson.
Benson's karaoke go-to is what is it?
Basket Case?
No, Basket Case is the one he does that, like you'd expect him to do.
Yes,
but he
Fight
also
for Your
does
Right to Party.
Cracking rendition of an Annie Lennox tune.
Oh,
which you would not expect. Sweet Dreams, Eurythmics.
Sweet Dreams. Oh, right, yes.
Which I've seen him do to great effect on more than one occasion.
Going to have to request that the next time I see him.
Those of you who don't know Benson, Dave Benson is a great friend of ours and an absolute legend on the sort of overlapping Venn diagram of London web technology and event management and music and all these kinds of things.
Yes.
He's also the only person I know who has blown 2 separate microphones by just being that loud.
Yes.
So, yeah.
But no, so the Beastie Boys, and I remember I was living with my aunt and uncle and my cousins at the time, because reasons, and we all had our own music that we'd bought, and they played. We took it in turns as to who was having their music played in the car when we were all driving somewhere, and we managed to listen to, I think, the first 3 songs of the Beastie Boys album, and then it was taken out of the cassette player and it was never played in the car again. It was not acceptable, and so obviously that made me like it even more.
So you've just reminded me of two fun little things. One is a sort of international geek out, and the other one is a very personal geek out detail. Mentioning, the ZX Spectrum, and you had to have a tape recorder to load and save software on it. Did you know that during the 1980s, there were a couple of countries where they would broadcast software on the radio?
I did, yeah.
I think the BBC tried it for a while, and there was a pirate radio station somewhere in like what was the Eastern Bloc at the time, in somewhere like Poland or East Germany, that would broadcast computer software.
Yes.
So you would you'd get your tape deck ready, and like 2:00 in the morning, you'd listen for the broadcast and tune in your FM tuner, and then they would be like, "All right, everybody, get ready. When we say go, press record on your tape recorders. There'll be a few seconds of silence, and then you're going to get 30 minutes of Space Invaders broadcast in like FM radio quality."
Yes.
And if you were lucky, if you got no interference, you could then take that cassette and open the load routine on your Spectrum or your Commodore or whatever it was for, and load the game and play it, which I think is the first example of wireless pirate software distribution in history, and did not somehow turn out to be the success story that it perhaps could have been.
Yes.
But there was also, if anyone remembers, a show called Games Master, which was like a 6:00 tea time show on Channel 4 in the UK
with Patrick Moore for some reason.
Patrick Moore and Dominic Diamond, and and it was enthusiastic and well spirited, and clearly, because I was massively into games, I read all the gaming magazines and everything, and there was just something about it that felt a little bit like, hey, fellow kids.
Yes, definitely.
But that had a thing called the Data Blast, which was the last sort of minute of every show. They would just flash up, cheat codes and game tips and reviews and things. And the idea was you record it on your VHS tape recorder, your VHS video recorder, and then freeze frame through it to get all of these, cheat codes and walkthroughs and level guides, which was another kind of, probably the most interesting thing about that show was that, the fact that they'd come up with a way of getting basically a magazine's worth of content into the closing credits of a television program if you could record it and freeze frame it.
Yes. I remember somebody probably in the 80s, I'm assuming, released a vinyl single which had software on the B-side that you could load into a Spectrum. I can't remember who it was, but it was, and I'm pretty sure it was like a novelty record, so it would have been somebody like the KLF or on the B-side of Doctor in the TARDIS or something like that.
Because the one that
Radiohead have also done that quite recently.
Yeah.
Yes, there was,
and there was also the great tradition of when games came on CD-ROM, the game soundtrack.
Yes.
The game would be track 1, which would be a data track. Yeah. And so if you wanted to, you could take Total Annihilation and listen to it in the car. And that had a cracking soundtrack. It was fantastic. If you've never heard it, I think, was it Alexander? No, Alexander Brandon wrote Deus Ex. I'm going to look up who it is so you can all go out and look them up and listen to them after you listen to this.
Yes.
Except I can't spell annihilation. There we go. That's it. But no, you... talking about Jeremy Soule was the composer, Soule, and it's phenomenal. Full, like, massive orchestral. It made that game seem massive because when you built your 1,000 tanks and then you marched them into battle, you'd get this soaring string section. It was wonderful.
Yes.
We drove to France. My family drove all the way through France to the Costa Brava when there were 6 of us. So I was maybe 15 years old, and I'm the oldest of 4. So I'm 15, my sister's 13, and my brothers are 10 and 8. And we are driving for a total of about 80 hours to get all the way there, and then go and visit all the things my parents wanted to visit, and then drive all the way back. And they had a rota system. They're like, no, the music, when we get in the car, everyone gets half an hour. And so you have half an hour of your music, and then it's someone else's turn. And I had brought, I had Pornograffiti by Extreme and 5150 by Van Halen and a couple of other, like that sort of, guitar rock. Balance by Van Halen had just come out, so that was on the trip. My kid brothers were both like, they would listen to whatever I told them to listen to. And so every trip would be 50% Extreme and Van Halen. And the only tape my sister brought was the Pulp Fiction soundtrack, which, as connoisseurs will know, is laced with profanity. Because every song, the music on it is, Tarantino did this great job of picking deep cuts and things you might not be familiar with. And I'm sure the whole family can still sing the Captain Kangaroo song because of it being on that record. But the little watching Captain Kangaroo. Yep.
Don't tell me.
That one.
Yeah.
But of course, before it, there are all these little interludes of dialogue from the movie, and I'm pretty sure that's where my brothers learned all the swears. And the system broke down because my folks were like, "You can't listen to that," and she's like, "No, I get half an hour, and it's the only tape I brought."
Yes,
and it was such a perfectly crafted piece of turning the system against itself, teenage rebellion.
So when I was 9, 1982, my dad, we had one of the original Volkswagen camper vans, orange on the bottom, white on the top.
We had an orange and white Volkswagen camper.
And the roof lifted up and everything. And he wanted to get his money's worth. He just bought this thing. He wanted to get his money's worth out of this bloody van. So we drove to Greece. And this was 1982. So the route to Greece involved going
Hastings,
from Hastings.
Yeah.
So
which is on the south coast of the UK, if folks don't know where Hastings is. Yeah.
So we drove to Dover, got the ferry, drove through France, Belgium, West Germany. We couldn't go through East Germany because apparently beards were illegal or something. And so my dad was like, well, we can't go there because I'm not shaving my beard off. So then I think we went through Austria and then Yugoslavia. And all the way down through Yugoslavia, which isn't there anymore because it's Serbia and Croatia and all those places.
Montenegro, yeah.
And then all the way down Greece to the bottom so that we could go to Thassos.
Yeah.
The island of Thassos. And bless him, I think this may be the nicest thing he ever did. Or certainly the most effort he put into doing something nice. The BBC Radio 4 did a full-length dramatization of the whole of The Lord of the Rings. And he recorded every single episode onto like 120-minute cassette tapes. And we're talking, like 48 hours of stuff in total. Yeah. And that's what we listened to all the way to Greece and back again. And I remember really enjoying it. So there's a lot of people would go, oh, but no, it was great. It was really well done. And my memory of certain scenes, the one where it's either Pippin or Merry gets hold of Saruman's orb of seeing and goes, "Oh, I'm going to have a look in this," and then the fool of a took line. Yep. And I distinctly remember that from that recording and listening to it on that trip. And it was about the only thing that made driving all the way across Europe tolerable, really.
I mean, it's funny the way this is something I think humankind has probably now lost forever. But that constraint of being, you choose what you have in the car, and then that's it. That is your selection for the foreseeable future. And we, one of my youngest brothers was David. His mum was in hospital for a long time when she was pregnant with him. And so we'd go and see her pretty much every day. And the tape that was in the car was disc 1 of Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds, with 2 songs from the Electric Dream soundtrack taped onto the gap at the end of the cassette. Which is another thing, we kind of lost forever. I was talking to some folks the other night about, imagine a Spotify plugin where you say go, and what it does is it cuts the song off that's playing after 45 minutes exactly.
Yes.
So anyone who ever recorded CDs onto a TDK D90 cassette, you get this nostalgia blast where Wasted Time by Skid Row cuts off halfway through, and you're like, just like it used to, and then you turn the tape over and it would start again.
Yeah.
And there are all these albums where like the last 3 minutes, just I never, it doesn't feel anything like as nostalgic as the rest of the album because it wasn't on the tape version I had.
I remember sort of trying to find the song that ends just past the halfway point of the CD. And then you would stop recording, then turn the tape over, don't rewind or anything, and then record the rest of it, so that when you had an auto reverse Walkman and that song finished, you could just press the button and the next song would start playing. And so you only had to actually do the rewind or fast forward or whatever at the end of the second side. Oh, well,
it never occurred to me to do that. I totally did the thing where you would rewind by spinning the tape around a pencil because you didn't want to waste your Walkman batteries on rewinding.
Yeah,
but
no, that was a cunning trick. I was pleased with that one.
So we had this one cassette, which was Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds, and then Together in Electric Dreams, and a track called The Duel, which, if you know the movie, it's the scene where Virginia Madsen is playing her cello, and Edgar, the sentient computer, is listening through the wall and jamming along with her, which was written by, I think it's written by Giorgio Moroder and Jeff Lynne. From Electric Light Orchestra. And and so those two, and this was like the only tape that was in the car. And so every time we got in the car, we'd be like, did we remember to bring? No one brought another tape. Right, I guess we'll listen to War of the Worlds again. Every word, every note, every lyric, every line of dialogue from disc one is in here and has been for decades. I did not hear the second disc of that until I was in my 20s.
So as far as you were concerned, it was just about the Earth being conquered and humanity nearly wiped out.
I didn't even, I don't think I even knew there was a part 2. I just thought this was like a really successful Martian military campaign set to disco music, the end, which actually works surprisingly well. But and the second disc has got, David Essex and Phil Lynott as the parson and everything. It's got some cracking tunes on it.
So what was the first gig you ever went to?
So this would have been I'm pretty sure it was Magnum at the Bristol Colston Hall it would have been 1988 or 89. They did a Christmas tour every year, and their album. So Magnum they're one of those bands that have a fanatical fan base. And they're at that level where you will not find a Magnum song on any karaoke machine anywhere in the world, despite the fact that in their heyday, they could sell out the Birmingham NEC Arena for a couple of nights in a row. They never broke America. They never performed or toured in America. They were started in the 70s by this guy, Tony Clarkin, who was this guitar player and absolutely prolific songwriter. And Bob Catley was his sort of singer and sparring partner. And between the two of them, they basically collaborated and did music for 50 years. And Tony Clarkin died in January, a week before their 27th studio album came out. Right. And, suddenly all the guitar and press magazines are like, this prolific stalwart of British rock, and these really quite nice tributes. But yeah, I heard Rockin' Chair on Tommy Vance's Friday Rock Show, and went, that sounds good. I like that. And I think Magnum was certainly the first band that I ever discovered on my own, instead of like through my dad's records or one of my school friends lending me a tape. They were the first band that I went into school and went, hey, there's this band you got to check out. And of course, by that point, all my friends were like, no, we don't like rock anymore. We're all into hip hop and Public Enemy because we're 10-year-old white kids in Bristol. And what could be more authentic than us thinking we're, Run DMC? Yeah. And so no, I said to my dad, "Can we go and see Magnum?" And he went, "Yeah, all right." And I got us some tickets, and it was the
That's quite
loudest
cool.
thing I'd ever heard in my life up to that point.
Hmm.
And I remember the support band was a band called Rocco, who were
Right.
Swiss and French and German, and had a minor crossover hit with a track called "One Night Stand," which is still on Spotify and is actually really good. And yeah, and I remember sitting watching this band and going, "This is really cool, and it's great." And I've been a sort of lifelong Magnum fan ever since. But it's one of those things. Like, do you have anything where, in the age before the internet, you thought you were a big fan of something,
Yes.
and then you discover the lengths that the fandom goes to, and you're like, "Actually, I'm a completely normal, well-adjusted human being who likes their music," you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Certainly with movies. I thought I
yeah.
liked Star Wars, and then you sort of see people cosplaying
Mm.
and living the lifestyle and actually kind of following
So my
Jedi as a
friend
religion and stuff.
my friend Jules, he lives in Ramsgate now, I think. And you go into his house, and his living room looks like a person who likes Star Wars, because it's got sculptures and figurines
Yeah.
and artwork on the walls and stuff. Then you get down to the basement. He's got his own Star Wars museum in his house, up to and including a life-size Han Solo in carbonite on the back of the door.
Good grief.
And at that point, you're like, you know what? I'm good. I don't need to catch them all. That's covered. Someone is taking care of that for me.
You've got this.
It's and he's the 501st Battalion, like the cosplaying thing. He's not a stormtrooper. He's Boba Fett. When the 501st do their, we're going to have 200 stormtroopers marching through London for the Halloween parade, and he's like, yeah, you'll be stormtroopers. I'm special. So. And his Boba Fett costume is fantastic, really, really good. But yeah, and when I got into Magnum, I was like, this is great. And then the internet came along, and there was a Yahoo Groups mailing list, and that's when you realize that owning all their records and seeing them on every tour, you've just kind of scratched the surface of how deep some people's enthusiasm for this band goes.
Yeah.
And but actually, the interesting thing about Magnum is that there is a spin-off band called Kingdom of Madness, which is two of the guys who were in that band in the 80s during their kind of, their most successful mainstream period, who got together a couple of years ago and went, we really liked playing those songs that we did in the 80s, but they weren't interested in joining the Magnum reunion that happened in 2003. And so they're like, well, we're just going to start a band. We're going to get a couple of musicians together, and we're going to play that period of this band's history. And it's kind of weird. It's not really a tribute band, because it's like 40% of the lineup that recorded and toured that stuff in the first place.
Yeah.
But the kind of the main songwriter wasn't involved, because he was still writing and recording as Magnum. And I saw them live at the ULU, University of London Union, a couple of years ago, and they were phenomenal. They were so good, really good fun. So what was the first concert you ever saw?
So I jumped in right at the deep end. I was 15.
Yeah.
And I actually remember it. So I had a horrible childhood, all told. And at the end of 1988, I was 15, and I was between living with my aunt and uncle and cousins up in Essex and a foster family in Hastings. Things were all a bit messed up, and I had a friend, and his 15th birthday treat was to go and see Jean-Michel Jarre, Destination Docklands, and his parents got me a ticket because they were kind of looking out for me.
Yeah.
And so I went to Destination Docklands and saw Jean-Michel Jarre.
That was your first concert?
That was my first concert. I thought all concerts were like that. I was quite disappointed at my second concert. But no, that was insane. So Jean-Michel Jarre, obviously huge in the 80s, electronic music, all just instrumental stuff. But this show, there were a lot of fireworks, and there were a lot of lasers, not least the laser harp the musical instrument that he would play just by putting his. And he had to wear asbestos gloves to play it.
Is that what the gloves were for?
Yeah, those lasers were actually hot. They would have caused cell damage if he hadn't been wearing the gloves. But yes,
Wow.
and it was when Docklands was still being built, so Canary Wharf was still under construction, and they still had all the scaffolding with the sort of tarpaulins hanging off it, and so they put these big screens up on there. But the two councils that were involved, because it was kind of like the south bank of the river and the north bank of the river, were like, you are the biggest fire risk we've ever heard of, and you are not playing on our side of the river. And so they basically lashed a load of barges together and built the stage on that, and he was floating in the middle of the Thames doing this thing. But they had projections going up onto all the buildings in Docklands in the background, and like balls bouncing across. It was insane. For the 1980s, it was absolutely ridiculous. And so, yeah, that really raised my expectations of live music in a way that nobody has ever managed to. The only thing I think I could have gone to since then, and which I didn't, sadly, was the Pulse Pink Floyd concert, Earl's Court '94. But yeah,
and perennial question comes up. You know, what concert that you weren't at do you most wish you'd been at?
That one.
And definitely, and for me, it's a toss up between Pulse and Dire Straits at Hammersmith when they recorded Alchemy. But you know, when they recorded Alchemy, I was 5 years old and I was living in Zimbabwe and I didn't know who Dire Straits were. But I got into Pink Floyd like when the Division Bell came out. There was all this kind of excitement in the press, and I'd never heard Pink Floyd before.
Right.
I think Dad owned Dark Side of the Moon, but didn't listen to it very often. And so I was like, you know, who is this band? And a couple of friends at college were like, oh, no, you got to check them out. Someone lent me The Wall, and I got into that.
Yeah.
And like by the time I realized it was important, Earl's Court had sold out.
Yes.
And I was like, I guess they'll do another one. And of course, they didn't. That was game over. That was the final Pink Floyd tour. And the concert footage from that I've seen probably upwards of 50 times. And
I have it on Blu-ray.
Yeah.
Remastered. The thing I really like, because I got the CD of Pulse when it came out, and it had the red flashing LED on the spine, but you couldn't replace the battery on that. The Blu-ray case has the red flashing LED, and on the inside it has a AAA battery. And so when the light stops flashing, I can replace the battery and put it back on. Did you
ever hear about the Publius Enigma?
No.
So this was 1994. It would have been. That was Division Bell, wasn't it? Earl's Court, October '94, when kind of the internet as a thing normal people did was just starting to take off. So we didn't have Windows 95 yet, just to kind of put this in historical perspective.
Ow.
But the web existed, and, you know, Usenet groups and stuff was starting to, people outside of universities and computer science laboratories were sort of starting to get modems, and CompuServe was a fairly established thing, and America Online. And there was a Pink Floyd fan group on Usenet. And somebody calling themselves Publius started posting these cryptic messages about something big was coming up involving the band. And then at one of the shows, everyone was like, it's a hoax, it's nonsense. And this message came up saying, you know, something weird like look to our heroes at this particular time and date, and you will see a message. And then at one of the shows on the Division Bell tour during Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, the stage lights across the front of the stage flashed, Publius Enigma, Publius Enigma. And the fans went into meltdown because they're like, it's real. What is it? What's going on? What's the Publius Enigma? And and then nothing ever really came out of it.
Yeah.
And the sort of, years later, it's like, oh, that was probably Mark Brickman, who was Floyd's lighting designer, having a bit of a laugh with his friends on the internet. The band weren't really, like, the band weren't in on it, but they weren't going to fire him for doing it, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But, that was one of those little moments where I remember thinking the internet is going to change the relationship between musicians and their fans.
Yes.
And then a couple of years after that, Marillion, because Marillion invented crowdsourcing. This is something that not many people know about, but Marillion were, they had a couple of massive hits in the 80s when you could be a prog rock band who were also pop stars.
And fantastic album titles, like
yes,
Script for a Jester's Tear.
Script for a Jester's Tear and Misplaced Childhood.
Yes.
And, Kaylee was their massive smash hit.
Yeah.
And they, people kept saying, because Mark Kelly, their keyboard player, was a really early kind of adopter, dial-up modem in the 1980s kind of thing. And the Marillion fan group online is like, when are you coming to America? And they're like, we're not, because no one will pay for it. The record company won't pay for it. And so someone said, if we can raise the money, will you do the tour? And so a bunch of fans basically got together via Usenet, and they were like, all right, I've talked to there's a venue in Philadelphia that we need this much money, so if we can sell this many 100 tickets or whatever. And so basically the fans all bought the tickets in advance for concerts that would only happen if they got enough money. And they did.
Sort of like Kickstarter before Kickstarter.
Yeah, like Kickstarter before the web. I mean, this is,
Usenet.
Yeah.
Music.marillion.kickstarter.
And then they, realized, and then when their record contract with EMI was up for negotiation, they sort of had this idea, like, we could do that with our next record. If we can sell the album before we've written it, then we can use the proceeds to pay for the studio time, which means we own the recordings, and then we can take a finished record and take it to, EMI and everyone, go, look, this is done. If you want to distribute it, then you don't have to front any money for the studio thing. We'll just sign a contract and you start making CDs.
But you don't own the recording.
They're beautiful, massive, like, so obvious no one realized what they were doing, was their final album for EMI was called Marillion.com, which kind of put their web address in front of every single Marillion fan on the planet who went to it and went, oh, look, I don't need to talk to EMI about the next record. I can buy it now. And they're a fascinating band. They're one of those bands who, when I go and see them live, if they pick the songs I like, it'll be one of the best shows I've seen. But they can easily fill an arena or fill a venue with 3 hours of material I don't want to hear ever again in my life.
But in terms of live music, the other sort of one that popped into my head was in the early 90s. I was living in Hastings, and we had the Crypt, which is actually quite a lot of people outside of Hastings will have heard of the Crypt because it was a destination place. And
the Crypt recently burned down in suspicious circumstances, after which the people who owned the freehold said, oh, well, it's too broken to put another nightclub there. It's going to have to be luxury flats. Sorry, Your Honor.
Really, really disturbing.
No capitalism.
So we used to go on Friday nights because Friday nights was dance, club music and DJs and all that sort of thing. But we would also just go there during the week just to drink beer. And you would get the up and coming bands that were doing the circuit before sort of getting their first record deal and whatever. And so I was down there one night. I was very tired. I was sitting at a table right in front of the stage, and a band I'd never heard of called Blur were playing. And I think I lasted about one song and then just fell asleep with my head on the table and slept through sitting at the front. I mean, if I'd been Blur, I would have thrown a pint of beer over my head to wake me up, because that's
somewhere out there, Damon Albarn is in an interview going, we played the Crypt in Hastings, and there was a guy at the front who was asleep in the front row with his head on the table.
But no, I think I saw quite a few. I think I saw Garbage there as well. Not Oasis. I remember. I specifically remember not Oasis. And I was definitely Team Blur in that sort of manufactured rivalry in the Britpop era.
There was Team Oasis, there was Team Blur, and then there was Team Pulp, which was the people who did not care for the manufactured rivalry.
I did love Pulp.
Yeah.
Yeah. To the point where I have I've got a Stuff playlist on Apple Music, and I just kind of go, oh yes, that should be on my Stuff playlist. And so now it's about 5 hours long. And it's great. You stick it on shuffle, and it's just like having a radio station that only plays songs I like. And it's got Common People and Disco 2000 and Sorted for Ease and Whiz.
Yeah.
But when Common People ends, it should be I Spy a Boy, I Spy a Girl. I spy the best thing in the whole world. Because, I remember the album and not shuffling it. And so whenever a song finishes, I'm kind of like, I know what should be next. But then it turns out it's actually Love Story by Taylor Swift.
Have you ever accidentally listened to an audiobook on shuffle?
No.
I have done this once.
Idea. Yes.
By mistake. I was listening to Kaminsky Heights, which is a wonderful daft thriller about a guy who has to infiltrate a secret Russian research station in Siberia. And somehow I managed to get it playing the audio tracks in shuffle for the first few. I was like, this is very kind of avant-garde. And then when, after listening to several sections, I heard chapter 12, I'm like, I don't remember anyone saying chapter 11 or chapter 10. And I was like, oh dear. And the other fun digital shuffle experience is I had an iPod Touch that I just had all the songs on.
Yeah.
And I was skiing with it one day and just put it on shuffle at the top of the mountain because there was nobody else on the slope. It was completely clear. I listen, put it on shuffle and it played like a 3-minute pop song. And then David Swenson pipes up, "Hi, this is David. Welcome to the 45-minute yoga routine." I was like, I should have taken all the yoga off the playlist before I put it on shuffle. And it's like, I got to stop. I got to go. And I sat by the side of this ski run in France and went through this playlist and deleted all of the David Swenson's yoga short forms.
Yes.
And then was like, right, that's it. Now we're down to, Van Halen and Beastie Boys, and off we went.
I have one song on my Stuff playlist. It's the Nirvana Unplugged that they did for MTV.
Yeah.
The Man Who Sold the World.
Yes.
Which I think it's one of those covers that I like better than the original version.
There aren't many, but yes.
There aren't many, but that is one of them. Also, Sound of Silence by The Disturbed is the other one that always pops to mind when someone says that. But at the end of that track, the Man Who Sold the World, there's like a minute of Kurt talking to the rest of the band and like trying to work out what key they're playing the next song in and all this sort of stuff. And I quite like having it there.
Yeah.
It's like having Kurt back almost. So I like listening to it.
So on the there's an extended collector's edition of Jeff Wayne's musical version of War of the Worlds, which includes like all the outtakes and the different languages and like the No One Would Have Believed, but in German and in Spanish. And one of the really bizarre things that's on there is the unedited recording of Richard Burton coming into the studio and sitting down and them saying, you're right, is the chair okay? Could we get you a cup of tea? And it's like, oh, yeah, tea would be lovely. Yeah, 2 sugars, please. And then they're like, all right. And he says, all right. No one would have believed. And you're like, no, you don't go from 2 sugars, please, to no one would have believed. And it gives you this little, like, lovely insight into all the stuff you don't see, going on behind the scenes, which I kind of like. We are just about out of time, and I want to end this with something that came up in conversation recently, which I just thought was a fun question.
Yes.
If you could keep one album from each decade of your life, by like a calendar decade, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, what album would you keep?
Right.
Start with the 70s.
So 70s. I'm going to cheat.
Yeah.
And you'll find out how I'm going to cheat later. So from the 70s, I would keep The Wall.
Yep.
Because it's not my favorite Pink Floyd album, but it has my favorite. It's got Comfortably Numb on it, and I can just listen to it. And when I'm struggling with depression or something, I find it very therapeutic to put The Wall on, because I can go, well, at least Roger Waters is more depressed than me. So yes, from the 70s it would be The Wall. From the 80s,
so my 70s, while you think about
what would your 70s be? Yeah,
I think it would have to be the War of the Worlds. And that, considering that Dark Side of the Moon, and when was Wish You Were Here?
That was between Dark Side and The Wall.
Yeah, so we got Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and The Wall, three of the best albums of certainly in my my favorite albums of all time, all of which I think are fantastic, but all of which have bits that, like, every time I listen to Dark Side of the Moon, I sort of, on the run, always like, this is not as timeless as some of the material on this record. Yeah. And there are bits and pieces in the middle of Wish You Were Here where it just kind of goes a little patchy, and they all have amazing moments. And there are, The Wall has some astonishing highlights. But I think the Jeff Wayne's musical War of the Worlds, just every time it's about to start flagging, they throw in something different. And the musical segue from Forever Autumn into Thunderchild is just fantastic. Like, this jam has been going on almost long enough, and then they just drop in, and you don't kind of realize till afterwards it's a key change and it's a time signature change, and it's fantastic. And it just stands out. The session playing on that record, most of the musicians who played on it went on to form Sky, which was this classical rock crossover supergroup who nobody's ever heard of, but they were like their live concert. You talk about Jean-Michel Jarre at Docklands. Their live concert was Westminster Abbey, which is not something a lot of rock bands have ever been invited to do. So yeah, I think I with all apologies to Pink Floyd and Black Sabbath and Eagles and everyone else, it's got to be Jeff Wayne's musical version of the War of the Worlds.
Well, fair enough.
And if I can only have one disc one. all the best songs and a downbeat ending.
Fair enough. I'm going to cheat for the 80s.
Yeah. You're not allowed now. That's what I call Music 1986.
Oh, no. It's not. Am I allowed Queen Greatest Hits?
Yeah.
Because I would struggle to choose a Queen album. But I'm pretty sure Queen Greatest Hits came out in the 80s.
See, if I had to pick one Queen album, it would be Greatest Hits 2.
That hasn't got Bohemian Rhapsody on it.
Yeah, but it's got I Want It All, it's got Headlong, it's got Radio Gaga, it's got Hammer to Fall, it's got I think it's the one that showcases and I'm going to go wildly speculative here because I have nothing to back this up other than being a long-term Queen fan. It's the one where Brian May got better at writing Queen songs.
Yes.
As opposed to writing Brian May songs, and kind of would go into the studio. And it's also, they famously had this thing where they just eventually went, you know what? Music and words by Queen. That's it. Everyone bring your 3 strongest songs to the studio and we will turn them into something all of us are proud of, and we'll split everything 4 ways. And they're the only band in history, I think, who've had a #1 single independently written by every member of the band, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I think 80s for me would have to be Appetite for Destruction by Guns N' Roses.
Really?
Just because, it's...
Not Brothers in Arms?
No. Brothers in Arms had... I mean, it had some great hits on it, but Appetite for Destruction was just such a... so different. It took the whole idea of glam rock and went, we don't have time for Hairspray, and we are actually about 2 bad nights out away from literally all dying.
Yes.
And that kind of how Mike Klink, the producer, managed to get them in the studio for long enough to actually make a record, I will never understand. They were living in a garage. Like half the band were living in a garage in Los Angeles and sleeping in shifts because it wasn't big enough for all of them to sleep at the same time. And but no, that record, Sweet Child of Mine, Welcome to the Jungle, Rocket Queen, Paradise City, Anything Goes. It's like the Thriller of hard rock albums. It's like somebody sat down and went, we're going to make a record where every song on this record could be a hit. And they came pretty close, I think, I think inadvertently, I don't think they sat down to do that. And it's really interesting because November Rain, which ended up on the Use Your Illusions albums 5 years later, there's a demo of Axl recording that in a studio in 1986 and then saying, no, that's not going on the first record. That's going on the second record. And, the extent to which he had this song, which would go on to become a massive hit, but he's like, no, we're not doing that now. That's not what we are going to break the world with. We're going to do that later once we've established it. And I had talking about, restrictions, like you only had one tape in the car. I used to have a Tamno MP3 player, which I bought from scan.co.uk for about £100. And it had a proprietary cable and it had its own special software to upload stuff to it. There was nothing standardized. And I lost the cable, which meant I had this 128 meg MP3 player. And the music that was on it when I lost the cable was Appetite for Destruction by Guns N' Roses. And that was my portable music player for about a year. If I left the house, I was listening to Appetite. That was it. And it never got old. It, going to the gym and going on bike rides and train journeys and stuff for a year was Appetite for Destruction all the time. And it just, it stood that test of time like you wouldn't believe.
Yeah, there you go. So, 90s.
The decade that music forgot.
The decade that music forgot. But this is where I get to cheat.
Yes.
Because from the 90s, I would keep Pulse by Pink Floyd. And
because
on the B-side of Pulse, the first 8 tracks, they basically just did Dark Side of the Moon live.
Yeah.
And so I get to keep The Wall from the 70s, but I actually have a playlist. I don't have the Dark Side of the Moon album on my my iPhone. I have a playlist that I made that is just the Dark Side of the Moon from Pulse. And it actually it works really. It also has what I think is the definitive version of Comfortably Numb, with the guitar solo that just goes on and on and on, and you don't mind, you don't want it to stop. But yes, it's essentially it's Dark Side of the Moon, but recorded with much better equipment and sort of gold mastered onto hard discs and all that sort of thing. And also it's got Guy Pratt playing the bass, and he is an infinitely Roger Waters, very good at writing lyrics and songs and that sort of thing. He was a functional bass player.
Yeah,
I think I am probably, after like a year and a half, approaching Roger Waters' skill level. I can play Money. And I think that was probably the trickiest one he ever had to play.
Roger Waters as a bass player, and also Mark Knopfler as a singer. And there are many examples of this. Are great examples of people who write to their own strengths.
Yes.
And Roger Waters was a phenomenal, I think still is a phenomenally talented songwriter. But I don't think any session producer ever went, who we need to get to do bass on this? Get Roger Waters on the phone.
Yeah. And there's more than a few songs.
Pratt was we get him in for Madonna, we'll get him in for this, we'll get him in for that, we'll get him in for
ridiculous amounts of stuff. But no, because there's a few of the album recordings for Pink Floyd where the bass part's being played by David Gilmour as well, because Roger Waters couldn't keep time or something. So, but yes, so from the 90s, I would keep Pulse.
Yeah.
How about you?
The 90s was, so I have long had this theory. There was basically a decade when guitar music wasn't cool and wasn't successful, and
except grunge.
Pink Floyd killed it with Division Bell came out, and it was this very kind of high fidelity, slightly overblown, self-congratulatory, which I
Yeah.
like, but I can understand why the people who didn't like it. And the whole 80s glam metal scene is already kind of reeling because Appetite for Destruction made them all stupid. And then, grunge happens, Britpop happens, Spice Girls and Boyzone and Backstreet and all this kind of stuff. And the next album, I think, that really kind of was brilliant guitar playing that cracked the mainstream was Absolution by Muse, which was a decade later.
Yeah.
But then there's all this stuff going on in the background. And the standout album of the 90s for me is one that sneaks in by 3 months because it came out in October 1999. And it's Scenes from a Memory by Dream Theater, which I still think is the best record that band ever made.
Yeah.
And I just got tickets to see them. They're doing their 40th anniversary tour, and they're opening the tour at the O2 in London in October.
Oh, wow.
And Mike Portnoy, who
I
believe they are still on sale.
Okay, I might have a look.
Have a look. And but no, Mike Portnoy, who was their drummer for a long time, he left the band about 10, 12 years ago. Right. And people, I think, subsequently realized that not only was he a formidably talented drummer, he also, he was the taste. He was the person in that band who was kind of going, no, this is a little bit self-indulgent. Let's not do it. Because, I think even the best, most ardent Dream Theater fans have to admit that The Astonishing was not a standout record by anybody's imagination. Very, very kind of self-indulgent and overlong and stuff.
Dream Theater they were kind of one of the bands that brought prog back.
Yeah.
Infused it with metal.
I mean, so I saw Dream Theater, I saw them at the Forum in Kentish Town, which holds about 300 people. Right. And then I saw them at the Hammersmith Apollo, which holds about 600. Mm-hmm. And then I saw them on the prog stage at a festival, and then a year later they were at the same festival, but they were on the main stage.
Yeah,
because they'd clearly transcended prog now. And now I got tickets to see them at the O2, which is one of the biggest concert arenas in the country. And I just, it's nice to see a band who you loved when no one else loved them. And, you kind of stuck with them and gone to see it and bought the records. And, musically, they've always been phenomenally talented.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my standout record of the 90s. And if it had been 3 months later, it would have been the 2000s.
Yes. Yeah. So the 2000s, I'm going to go with Alive, Daft Punk.
Yeah.
I love Daft Punk. In the 90s, certainly the early 90s, I was going to all-night raves and outdoor things. There was one particular one where we started off in an airfield somewhere in Sussex.
Yep.
Or Kent, possibly. And that was Friday night. And then on Sunday morning, somehow we were in a valley in Wales with Spiral Tribe. But no,
was it the same weekend?
It was the same weekend. I'm pretty sure it was the same weekend
somewhere where they just put speakers on the back of a van and everyone just
it was just
the M4
a convoy of cars going along the M4 down to Wales, following this kind of bus with a sound system on it. But no, so I like my dance music. I like my electronic music, and I think Daft Punk, they made the stuff that, yes, you could stand in a field and dance to it, but you can also just listen to it. And so, and Alive is, again, it's another live recording album. And so you got the crowd sound in the background and all that sort of stuff. And so it's sort of like a greatest hits, but it just hangs together really well.
Yeah.
And I listen to that a lot while I'm coding, because it's, you're not listening to the words very much. It's music. Cool. So how about you?
I think the 2000s would have to be Absolution. The Muse album. Time is Running Out and Hysteria are just standout, and one of the best noises I've ever heard is the title track, Absolution. You listen to that in the car with really good bass speakers in it. And when Chris Wolstenholme's bass comes in, it's just like the whole boom, boop, boop.
Yeah.
It's sublime.
And I mean,
And
obviously, as a bass player, I approve of Muse because Chris Wolstenholme is such a big part of the sound.
Yeah,
because it is just the three of them.
It is, and they met in school. Like they were rehearsing in the
Oh,
music room at a secondary school in Teignmouth in Devon, and
yes,
you know, and
but
one of my great regrets is that I was at Glastonbury the year Muse headlined on the Pyramid stage.
Oh wow!
And I didn't know about them yet.
Right,
so I didn't
that
go
would
and
have
see
been
it.
when Black Holes and Revelations was out, because that was when they really went up another level.
And yeah,
no,
Absolution is just full of fantastic stuff, and the production's great. And for me, after that, they kind of went off a cliff. I never got into another. I quite liked some of Uprising, whatever it was called, the album after that.
Was that Origins of Symmetry?
No, that was earlier.
Oh, hang on, Drones.
No, not that one. The one with
so there's the third law of the third law.
We're going to look up Muse albums now because I can't remember. What about the 2010s?
2010s.
The Resistance, it was called. Uprising.
Oh yes, that's right. The Resistance,
and that was also a very good record, but I'm getting a little bit less.
So the 2010s, Billie Eilish, When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go? I think that was 2019.
Yeah,
I think. And because I'm now into my 40s and in the 2010s, and I'm at that point of all new music is rubbish and samey, and it's all just R&B and all that kind of thing, and it doesn't really do it for me. And then when Billie Eilish came along, and I found out about her because she played Glastonbury, and I was just kind of like, oh my god, she's amazing. And that album, the first album, it's just so creative and different, and I love the minimalist sort of music that goes over it, and she's just got an incredible voice. And so I could listen to that over and over again. So yeah, I will go with that one for the 2010s.
The 2010s for me is weird. There's really, if I listed my top 100 albums of all time, I don't think any of them would be from that decade. And I don't know why that is. It just, whatever was happening in the mainstream and coming out there. The one that stands out was Stephen Wilson's The Raven That Refused to Sing, because it has some wonderful musicianship and some fantastic songs on it. And Nick Beggs playing bass and Chapman stick. And Nick Beggs was the bass player in Kajagoogoo when they were big in the 80s, and then disappeared for a bit, and then he came back as this I'm guessing he was always a talented instrumentalist, but he came back as this wonderfully kind of charismatic stage presence. And if you've not seen the Chapman stick, it's a 10-string cross between a guitar and a bass that you play by tapping the fretboard with both fingers. And it looks amazing when you watch someone playing this on a stage. And I saw them on that tour, on the Raven That Refused to Sing tour. And it's a really great record with great songwriting. And I still put that on your test about would I listen to it again. That one I'll still dig out and play that once in a while. So yeah, I have to give that one. But for me, the 2010s was a kind of dead decade in terms of great records. I don't think anything.
Great records. Yeah. Nothing stands out. And I would struggle if you said 20s. I would struggle. I don't know.
I will be surprised if there is a better record than Impera by Ghost this decade.
I will have to listen to
that. To me, is just phenomenally good. And Ghost are one of those bands who the whole shtick. I don't know how much you know about them. It's this Tobias
Nothing.
Forge is their
Nothing at all.
mastermind. He is their singer and songwriter, and every album he invents a new persona for himself based on a series of satanic popes. And everyone else in the
Okay.
band is completely anonymous. They are uncredited. They wear masks on stage. They are listed as nameless ghouls in the credits. And
Right.
it starts with this most ridiculous shtick you could possibly come up with, in that every album is the brainchild of a reincarnated satanic pope and his nameless ghouls. And, you know, the first album was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. And then that's him in one of his many papa guises. And then then they had Square Hammer was a bit of a kind of crossover hit. And then Dance Macabre was a hit. And then Impera is just a phenomenal record. And, you know, the production, the songwriting, everything about it. And there's always this thing with, there's music that's great because it's novelty. And there's music that's great because it's nostalgia. And then there's music that's just great. And, you know, my favorite albums of all time, probably half of them are just because I heard them so much growing up and now they're special and they're not objectively all that good. But then, you know, there's records you go back to and you're like, actually, I don't think this is just the novelty hasn't worn off and it's relatively recent. Maybe this is just a classic. So, but hey, I hope to be surprised. Let's get lots more better albums than that out there.
I'm hoping that the best album of the 2020s is going to be when one of us wins the lottery and is able to buy the licenses, and the Longbreakers could put out an album just called Songs We've Nicked and Ruined.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the legalities around parody covers are weird.
Yeah.
Satire is defended under law.
If
you were to write a piss take of a Motley Crue song all about, you know, doing drugs in Hollywood,
and
the courts would say, like, well, no, actually, you are public figures and they are satirizing your behavior.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Billy Joel didn't write any software development frameworks, so we cannot employ that defense.
Yes.
And if we were doing straight,
never wrote anything in JavaScript.
There's a lovely story about Don McLean, because, you know, Weird Al Yankovic did the Saga Begins, which was his American Pie parody. And Weird Al just calls people and says, "Can I do your song?" And they say, "Of course you can. You're Weird Al."
Yes.
Don McLean calls him one day, and like Weird Al's studio phone rings, and like, "Is Don McLean on the phone for you?" And he thinks, I'm in trouble. Like, what have I done? And the story goes, he answered it, and they said, "Hello, sir." And they said, "Hello, Mr. Yankovic. This is Don McLean. I just wanted you to know my kids are huge fans of yours, and they've been listening to your Star Wars song around the house so much that last night at the Olympic Stadium in Paris, I went to sing American Pie and I sung your words by mistake."
Oh, that's brilliant.
And, you know, that's lovely. I love that.
Yeah.
So anyway.
No, that is cool.
Do you have any parting thoughts for the future? I mean, by the future, I mean to beam from Saturday into Thursday by the magic of digital storage.
The only other thing that occurs to me is, as I was been thinking about this subject, my musical horizons have expanded enormously over the last 2 years, and because I now play an instrument. And so then you hear people going, "Oh, you have to listen to this and you have to listen to that," and everything else. And so I've been going off and just listening to stuff because it has a new bass line, or a good bass line that I need to hear, or, you know, there's something about it. And so, yes, I would say, you know, I tried to learn guitar, I tried to learn piano. I never got on with either of them, picked up a bass, and just something in my brain went, "Yep, we're doing this." And so, I would encourage everybody to try different instruments and see if you can find the one that clicks for you. Because being able to play and understanding music and a bit of music theory and chord progressions and all that kind of thing, it opens up a lot of music that you wouldn't necessarily listen to.
I'm going to add a
It's been
corollary
really
there.
good for me.
Do this in ascending order of size. Start with singing, and if you don't enjoy singing, try the harmonica. And if the harmonica is not for you, try the violin. And maybe the flute and the clarinet, and sort of work your way up, because if you get to a point where you discover that the double bass is your instrument, the rest of your life is going to be hell, because those don't travel light. And at the very least, try all the other instruments before you try the double bass or the drums
or the piano.
Well, the piano is just like, well, I'm not bringing.
I mean, you can get a keyboard, can't you?
Give me one. You provide one. And so Axl Rose, November Rain, parting thought. There is video of them performing that on their tour, and he's playing what looks like a concert grand piano, like huge thing. And at one point, Slash jumps up on top of it. He's playing the guitar solo standing on the piano. And Guns N' Roses tuned down a half step. So all their stuff, they play it in E, but it's actually an E flat or G flat, whatever. But if you watch the video closely, Axl is playing the piano. His finger patterns are what you'd play at concert pitch. So either it's a fake piano, it's a digital keyboard inside a concert grand case, or he has paid somebody to tune a concert grand piano down by half a step and then take it around the world with Guns N' Roses, so that every arena they play, there's a concert grand in the right tuning.
Yeah.
And I kind of
I suspect it's that second one.
For almost anybody else, I'd be like, yeah, it's a prop and they've just put like a Roland stage piano in it. But knowing Axl Rose and how much money they had on that tour, for all I know, they literally had a detuned Steinway Grand that they had to load on the 747 everywhere they went. I do not know. If you do know, mention it in the comments. But anyway, folks, thank you for tuning in. That wraps it up for our music geek out. We'll probably do more of these in the future.
If there's something else you'd like us to geek out on, then leave it as a comment on the podcast or on the YouTube video or wherever you're listening to this, or just tweet at us because we're on Twitter. And we'll look for something else to dig into next time.
Cool. You have a good week, folks. Look after each other. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.